What's up everyone, it's Dakota and welcome back to another Magic the Gathering video, and today we're going to be going over some of the biggest winners and losers from the March 11th, 2024 ban and restricted announcement that took place, well, yesterday as of the uploading of this video. We're going to kind of break down exactly why decks are benefiting or severely hurt by the announcements, or in some cases lack thereof, and kind of decipher like what the metagame could potentially look like and why we think it's going to play out that way. Of course, before we get too deep into the video itself, if you're not already subscribed to the channel and you want to see more modern Pioneer and longer form content, please consider subscribing to the channel and ring the notification bell so you know when those videos get posted. Be sure to tune in on Saturdays where me and my co-host Randy on the Casual Spikes podcast go over kind of like our initial reactions from the ban and restricted announcement, go over some of the preliminaries and other deck lists and stuff that kind of took place from the initial week of said banning. And yeah, that's all I got. So let's go ahead. Let's see some of the biggest winners and losers from the Pioneer format. That's where we're going to start, and then we're going to roll into the modern format. So let's go ahead, shift over to Pioneer. My biggest winner from Pioneer, with there being no changes made to the format, is Arake Phoenix. The deck had like a 58% win rate at the Pro Tour. It was the most played deck going into the event, was the most played deck at the event, and I can only imagine once people are done trying to play with, Rakdos Vampires, or at least testing it, trying to refine it, what have you, Arake Phoenix is still probably going to settle towards the top of the metagame. If not one, like a very close two. And with no changes, the decks are going to have to kind of like tune and kind of warp around Arake Phoenix. And even having like that, 58%, almost 60% win rate should have been enough for Arake Phoenix to probably get something banned from it. But didn't happen. The deck's still amazing. It's very explosive. It has a lot of nice tools to deal with some of the other creature decks that could attempt to race it, and the fact that, some of the other combo decks like Amalia are going to still be around that are going to kind of discourage some of the other like aggro decks in the format from being able to survive, just from the fact that like you can blow up the board, you play at sorcery speed, blow up the board, and then die on turn 3 from an attack from Amalia. And Arake Phoenix, in theory, I would say like the matchup should be like relatively even, given the fact that Arake Phoenix does have like a lot of the tools to interact with like the creatures and stuff of the Amalia deck. But at least in my personal opinion, like I've never really struggled against Phoenix, knock on wood. But overall, I can only imagine that Arake Phoenix will end up being the most played deck going into the RCQ season, and for that, I'm naming it the biggest winner from the no changes in the Pioneer format. My second big winners from the format is going to be Lotus Field, and I'll throw Amalia in here somewhere on the screen, hopefully. So, basically, like the combo decks of the format, the two main combo decks of the format are my second biggest winners. They put 3 copies, I believe, 3 copies in the top 8. Performed very well, I believe, at the Pro Tour, and just have a lot of things going for them where, they can win the game pretty quickly. We know Lotus Field, has some of those insane draws where it can win on like turn 3, turn 4. I can do it more consistently with like Archdruid's Charm to go find its pieces and put them into play at instant speed, which is not something that the deck really needed, but definitely doesn't hurt to have. And I say really didn't need because it's already kind of like this overbearing like combo deck in the format. It probably shouldn't exist. It's not a lot of fun to play against. And I can only imagine after doing it for so many rounds of a tournament, it's probably not that fun to even go through the combo because you're having to explain it, every time, or, mostly every time. And, it just kind of gets crazy. It seems like it's like a mentally taxing deck. And then you have like the Amalia combo deck, which can just absolutely blow out creature decks that are trying to play relatively fair unless they're trying to kill you on like turn 3, turn 4. And there's, trust me, in like my testing and stuff, like Boros Convoke, which may or may not show up later in this list, kind of gets blown out by Amalia. And just in itself, like if you don't interact with its creatures or its board, anything meaningful that way, you just die on turn 3. So definitely the combo decks of the format benefited a lot. They were already performing relatively well. They might not have been, the second and third most played deck in the metagame, but they were still, showing up in droves. They performed very well at the event. We saw like Amalia and Lotus Field both make it to the semifinals. We saw 3 of the 8 decks in the top 8 were Lotus Field or Amalia combo. And we saw many different variations of Amalia where we saw kind of a more finalized version of Lotus Field from from the most part. So definitely some of my other big winners. Not as big of a winner as Arake Phoenix. Again, just like already being the best deck, no changes, probably stays the best deck. These combo decks I can only seeing more play, in the early stages of the RCQ season, as I would imagine that these two decks and Arake Phoenix are kind of have a little bit of a target on their head, going into the RCQ season. And with the release of Thunder Junction coming out, I believe, relatively soon. So those are some of my big winners from the Bandon Restricted announcement. What are some of the losers of the Pioneer format? So my biggest loser from the BNR for Pioneer is going to be the Boros Convoke deck. It has a pretty bad matchup against Amalia. It can put a lot of pressure on like the Lotus Field deck, but I also think the Lotus Field deck can put enough kind of in the way until it's able to kind of properly set up and kind of go off, as long as it has a relatively decent draw. And, of course, the, Is It Phoenix deck, can kind of play pretty aggressive in stopping them from, putting a bunch of power into play with Venerated Loxodon, or getting some card advantage going with the Knight Errant of Eos and stuff. Knight Errant of Eos, whatever the other Convoke creature is. It's just kind of rough overall for it. It was a deck that was pretty busted, and a lot of people really weren't playing to begin with, and then Amalia combo started to show up, and Boros Convoke, at least seems like it's fallen off in popularity, and really doesn't have much of a reason to continue to see play, just based on the fact that Amalia combo is going to keep seeing play. The Lotus Field decks are going to continue to see play, and theoretically, I would think Arake Phoenix, with its power of trying to control the board, plus putting pressure into play, if it just has a relatively decent draw, maybe even a little bit on like the higher rolly side of draws, it should be able to handle the Venerated Loxodon decks very easily. So unfortunately, Boros Convoke, while I think a really fun deck to play, and watch it kind of go off a time or two, ends up being probably my biggest loser from the Pioneer format. Additionally, I think Control gets a lot worse too from this announcement. Definitely not worse off than the Boros Convoke deck. The Control decks definitely have a lot of play to them. Amalia combo is a pretty good matchup for Control, but it just seems like everything else might just be kind of a struggle for Control decks. And kind of like my issues in my video of what we learned from the Pro Tour, I think the traditional Rakdos mid-range decks and Control decks are going to have a little bit harder of a time consistently performing in these 2-day tournaments, simply for the fact that they kind of have these matchups that are, maybe 55-45 or 45-55 in their favor or against their favor, however you want to put it. And I believe that if you run pretty well, you're kind of in that 55%, and if you don't really run well, you're kind of in that 45-40%. I think Control, you're in a little bit worse of a spot if you kind of draw bad, where you don't draw enough lands, or you're just not drawing the right half of your deck, what have you. It can get pretty rough. So at least in my opinion, I would rather be on anything other than Control in the format, just simply for the fact maybe I don't respect it enough. But definitely with if Amalia combo sees an uptick in play, it becomes one of the most played decks in the format. And Blue White does have some tools to kind of play against. Is It Phoenix just didn't perform well, and honestly, that doesn't really sit well with me. And with no changes to the format, and again being the second or third most played deck at the Pro Tour, not putting any copies in the top 8, and really when it was on camera, just kind of getting absolutely demolished. Either by bad draws, which is something that does happen and feels really bad if you are the Control deck. It just doesn't sit well with me. I think it's a lot better position than Boros Convoke, just because the decks that Convoke is bad against, Control actually has a pretty decent matchup against. But due to bad draws or anything like that, you could still lose to those decks. Is it going to happen in 3 games? No, but if you lose game 1 and you struggle to close out the games in game 2 and game 3, especially against Amalia combo, you could just end up in the point where you end up losing the match because you're not able to win a game or win 2 games, in 20 minutes or whatever, what have you, whatever time is left after game 1 and stuff. So Control being one of my bigger losers, from the Pioneer format. And then we're going to shift gears. We're going to go look at Modern and see some of our big winners and losers from over there as well. Overall, my thoughts on the Pioneer, no changes. What I kind of expected. We're going to see a lot of like the same metagame, but I definitely think there are some players that would kind of show up that are going to kind of see, a nosedive kind of in like their play rate. And we're going to see kind of an uptick in some of these other stronger decks that kind of got to benefit. I didn't put Rakdos in here just because I think Rakdos is going to kind of be where it's at. I don't think it necessarily gets worse, but I don't think it gets better either. They definitely have some very powerful draws now that they're kind of into like this vampire shell rather than the Rakdos. So we're probably going to see less. We're going to see less of the traditional Rakdos deck that we're used to seeing, and we're going to see more of like the vampire variant, just because it's going to be able to close out games and interact a little bit better with the format that we've kind of created post-Pro Tour. So with that said, that's going to be the end of Pioneer. Let's go ahead and take a look at one of our biggest winners from the Modern ban list. Probably the biggest winners, I'm going to have Titan thrown somewhere in here, but Yawgmoth, Thran Physician, the Golgari Yawgmoth decks, and the Amulet Titan decks, I think are the biggest winners from this ban list. So while, as of the recording of this video, there's still a lot of people, that have made like the changes they need to make to their Cascade decks, and they're still pretty good. I mean, they're still relatively powerful. They're still doing a lot of cool things, and for what it's worth, Rhinos is still a really good matchup for Yawgmoth if it doesn't get to play at instant speed. But at least from the Yawgmoth and from the Titan perspective, they don't get to go, turn 3 on your turn, make Rhinos, and into like their turn 4 or whatever, make more Rhinos, and it's kind of like, getting to attack with Rhinos and then getting to leave some back on defense and then have to figure out a way to deal with them or, win the game. It's a little less swingy in that sense because you're going to kind of see the Rhinos coming. They're going to be able to still attack on turn 4, but, they're going to be tapped out. You're going to be able to do a lot of things. They're not going to really be able to interact with you all that much. And same thing with the like living index. You're kind of able to play, more on your turn. You're going to be aware of like the danger, like they could untap or do whatever, and then end up, casting their, Shardless Agents, their Ardent Pleas, Demonic Dreads, what have you, and, just it still end up getting to go off and win the game that way, or at least kind of give you another turn to kind of react and see what's going on. So definitely Yawgmoth getting to benefit from, if they're going to leave up mana on your turn, that they're going to kind of interact with you. They're not going to be able to interact with you or make Rhinos. It's going to be one or the other unless we have some kind of, Teferi shenanigans with like somehow playing like Demonic Dread or, any of the other like sorcery speed, like Cascade spells. But I think that they would have to dramatically change up their game plan. So definitely I see Yawgmoth and Titan being some of the biggest winners from this list. The decks are going to be playing like half a turn to a full turn slower. You're going to be able to set up combos and stuff. I think Yawgmoth cares less about the Rhinos now, simply for the fact that it kind of gets that extra turn to kind of do things. And a lot of the time, that's all it needed for the, from the Rhinos deck was the Stumble anyway. So I think they're definitely the early winners as we kind of wait for the modern metagame to shake out from the Violent Outburst banning. Ardent Plea is my next big winner from the modern format, specifically getting played in Rhino variants now. This was kind of the card that was floated out there if there was a Violent Outburst ban. Of course, it still forces the deck to play at sorcery speed, and, the Exalted really is not going to matter a lot of the time, but it's seen in, play in like the early like Rainbow Rhinos list. This is a card that you can pitch to Solitude to interact with your opponent, and with some Teferi variants, you're able to kind of like Ardent Plea, cascade into like Rhinos, and then you're able to play like a Teferi. You can bounce the Ardent Plea, or, tick up until you need to cast it, and then you're able to kind of do that as well. And there's certain turns, gets late enough in the game, you're able to kind of bounce it and then replay it, make more Rhinos, get in damage. The Exalted is going to be kind of nice, a lot of the time, because your Rhinos are going to be able to attack through other Rhinos, even if you don't have like your Scion plus Leyline combo, in play. So Ardent Plea definitely being a pretty big winner, I would say, of the banned and restricted list. Definitely not better than Violent Outburst. Violent Outburst, like instant speed, capability plus, you know, the uptick in like power, you know, was definitely relevant in a lot of cases, more for an instant speed cascade than it was for the actual text printed on the card. Ardent Plea is essentially going to do the same thing, where Exalted isn't really going to matter because, again, you're wanting to attack with, you know, multiple Rhinos and even like your Scion of Draco. But there's definitely going to be some cases where like the Exalted is going to be very powerful, where you just get to, you know, jam with one of your creatures, you know, if your opponent manages to kind of stop you from cascading or what have you, and your Scion of Dracos are going to be able to attack in like your opponents and, you know, not really have any favorable trades, blocks, or, you know, what have you. So Ardent Plea, and by extension, like the Rhinos decks and stuff, definitely the big winner. I think Ardent Plea more so than the other decks, just because they definitely got worse. Ardent Plea getting better because it is a 3-mana cascade spell, and the text is going to be a little bit more relevant, you know, in certain cases than I believe the extra just uptick in power. Like the 1 toughness is going to be super crucial a lot of the times for, you know, these kind of like stalled out board states from the Rhinos decks, stuff like that, especially if you have dueling Scion of Dracos. You know, you can attack with it and then it's a 5/5, you know, whatever, and your opponent's not really going to be able to, you know, benefit too much from trying to block, just from the fact that like they're not going to get rid of it and they're going to lose theirs, you know. So Ardent Plea, definitely one of my biggest winners from the BNR announcement. Let's go ahead, let's shift over to some of the losers of the format as well. To me, the biggest loser is Crashing Footfalls, and very specifically the Teamer Rhinos version of Crashing Footfalls. I have been saying before that the Teamer Rhinos version of like the Crashing Footfalls deck is definitely playing a card like Violent Outburst more fair than other decks are. You know, with just how their deck is naturally built, it's meant to be more reactive. You can kind of like play Tashana's Tidebinders, and you're able to kind of interact with some of your opponent's hate pieces that way. You know, you're able to leave up mana if you need to cast like Fire Ice, or you need to cast like a Dead Gone, even like hard cast Force and Negations, hard cast Subtleties, things like that. You know, Crashing Footfalls had like kind of that option where like, okay, it's safe to cascade now, so we can kind of go for it. And if not, then we get to play like this other, you know, kind of like tempo-y, control-y game plan and kind of cap it off with like a giant Murktide Regent, what have you. And it ended up being pretty good. And we knew Teamer Rhinos was probably the de facto best version of Rhinos, simply for the fact that it was the most consistent version of Rhinos. And while definitely, at least from like my perspective as a Yawgmoth player, playing against Teamer Rhinos was very annoying, and playing against Domain Rhinos absolutely sucks when they get like kind of their engine going. Teamer Rhinos specifically, I think, is the biggest loser. I mean, I just saw, you know, I saw the Living End deck play through a few pieces of Graveyard Hate, still set up and, you know, cascade with like Ardent Plea or, you know, Shardless Agent, what have you, and still kind of win the game. And I think while Crashing Footfalls had like theoretically a bad Living End matchup, I don't know why it's like so difficult, but it had like a bad Living End matchup, and I think Crashing Footfalls, like I said, specifically the Teamer version, gets a little bit worse. I think with the, you know, sorcery speed play of it, I think the Rainbow Rhinos decks get a lot better, just simply for the fact that like even if it's just tapping on its own turn, I mean, like you're not gonna be able to interact with the creatures, you're not gonna be able to interact with Scion. You know, if I have like my Leyline out, and you're gonna have to deal with the Leyline, and you know, we're probably gonna see these Rainbow Rhino decks kind of like tuned to kind of beat the Leyline of the Guild Pact, more so than actually being able to beat the other decks. And a lot of the things that it can do to beat, you know, the Leyline of the Guild Pact is going to kind of benefit a lot from, you know, the other decks in the format. So biggest loser, Teamer Rhinos. It's unfortunate. It's probably the worst Rhinos deck to play at sorcery speed, just because, you know, it doesn't have that option of like I can interact or I can go make Rhinos. It's I have to choose to make Rhinos or interact, and it still has those free spells. You know, it still can deal with like the creature and planeswalker spells with subtlety. It can still deal with the non-creature spells with the, you know, force and negation. But I think overall plays a little bit worse than, you know, just the kind of like high upside, you know, and the explosiveness of, you know, the Rainbow Rhinos list or even the Living End deck. So unfortunate. We kind of knew that this would happen. I just wish that the other decks were affected just a little bit more by it. But, you know, it is what it is. And let's go ahead. Our last big loser from the modern BNR announcement. Lastly, probably our biggest loser, Jund. No, I'm just kidding. Like, Jund's always a loser on the ban restricted list because he gets to play all these broken cards and never really ends up being all that good. But in all seriousness, I think the aggro decks are some of the biggest losers. Definitely, like, going from like a top tier deck, in Team of Rhinos, and definitely kind of being now the, from the best Cascade deck to I think the the worst of the three, at least from an initial standpoint. Aggro decks definitely are not going to benefit from this announcement. While sure it stops instant speed like Living End still puts a bunch of power into play, on turn 3 on its own turn. You still, like, you're not dying on that turn. I guess you can produce some like blockers and things like that, and like potentially whatever. There's a lot of things that you could potentially do, but traditionally the aggro decks that go 1 mana threat into 2 mana threat and 3 mana threat, tap out, try to put pressure on the board is kind of long gone. Sure, we have the kind of like really spiky, like really go huge, like Domain Zoo, aggro decks and stuff. And like, that's just kind of, to me at least, I guess it's an aggro deck, but like there should be at least a promotion of like different aggro decks in the format. That's just how I feel personally. Like, having one aggro deck in a sea full of, different decks that are playing combo, different decks that are playing like this kind of control-y, like tempo strategy, and playing just like creatures that cost less and are just a lot bigger than other aggro decks is pretty insane. Not saying that then we need to ban like every creature that plays way, way above rate that isn't named Tarmogoyf, but saying that like something like Rhinos is like an aggressive deck. I mean, you're right, it is winning by getting creatures into the red zone, but it's just not in a way that players should be playing, because I mean, you're putting, spending 3 mana to put 10 power into play, and then in conjunction with probably now going to be the most played variants of Rhino, where they get to play these creatures and they're uninteractable with it, ideally in a lot of circumstances. Aggro decks are, instead of having to kind of play their creatures like on turn 2, turn 3, they're going to have to spend their turn getting rid of Leyline of the Guild Pact to only still be facing down some really big creatures. And even if you play like a Tarmogoyf and it ends up being pretty big at like a 4/5 or a 5/6, you're just like, you're not beating a lot of what comes from the Rhinos decks. And like the Domain Rhino decks can still play Leyline Binding, get rid of your Tarmogoyf, and then just still hit you for 12, and more than likely it's just game over, if they don't play another Leyline of the Guild Pact or whatever. Like, it's just hard, and it's rough being an aggro deck. It's rough being Burn. While Burn is really annoying to play against, I think that like Burn is kind of like a benchmark for, a relatively healthy format. And I think while Burn is pretty bad, and while other traditional aggro decks are pretty bad, doesn't necessarily mean the format is bad, but it's definitely, to me, a little bit harder to say that the format is fine when there isn't multiple different decks. And aggro decks don't have to be like tier 1. Like, it doesn't mean that like there has to be a tier 1 deck for combo, control, aggro, and mid-range, what have you, and about every basic variant, and everything else kind of shakes out. But it would be nice if Tarmogoyf again was like one of like the better like aggro creatures, and Wild Nacatl and like all these other creatures were good by themselves, and then they only get better with the addition of Scion plus Leyline of the Guild Pact, which is kind of like the big thing. It's kind of a theme, if you will, for the winners and losers of this. So yeah, that is my winners and losers for Pioneer and Modern. Overall, again, very disappointed with how the ban list actually shook out. It definitely could have had more of an effect on Modern, and I think we only really killed like half of a Cascade variant. And all these other Cascade decks are priced are going to be pretty good. I figured that they would play a lot worse, not having instant speed Cascade, and sure, they would find other 3 mana Cascade cards. They have existed before, and that it would kind of slow them down, and it did. I just don't think it slowed them down enough to create kind of a healthy Modern metagame. And we're just going to see, more toxic variants of these kind of like Living End decks and these Rhinos decks going forward. Even though I named, Yawgmoth and Titan as like some of my big winners, just because if they get that like half turn or even full turn, they're going to kind of take it and run a mile with it. we could see some pretty big bannings if Modern Horizons 3 doesn't make a very big impact on the format and make a big impact in a healthy way, not in a Hogak way. So that's going to be me with this video. I hope you all enjoyed. If you did, please leave a like on the video. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Ring notification bell so you know when future videos get posted. Check out my link in the description to my Discord server. Go ahead and follow that link, join over there, as well as catching the Casual Spikes podcast that takes place every Saturday, or most Saturdays. We took a little bit of a hiatus, came back for the Bandon restricted announcement. That episode's doing well. Y'all are crushing it just overall, and I really appreciate all the support that I'm getting on the channel as we approach 500 on our road to 1K. So appreciate y'all for watching, hanging out, all that fun stuff. Oh, y'all are awesome. That's going to do it for me in this video. Hope y'all enjoyed, and I'll see you all in the next one.